I attended the cover conference in Bogota. It's not working? All right.
What?
Try? Nope. Do I need to turn it off? That's maybe that.
Yeah. Wait, it's not that.
Okay. All right. I'll go. In 2022, I attended the cover conference in Bogota, Colombia. Next.
Yeah.
As soon as I arrived in the city, I was struck by a barrage of color. On nearly every block, I encountered rich, vibrant, spray-painted images, lush, saturated hues of jungle flora, flowering plants, animals, hummingbirds, parrots, snakes, and predatory cats. There are massive portraits of indigenous people in traditional garb, contemporary Colombians dancing, kissing, shouting, or harvesting corn, and shamanic figures, ritual masks, and scenes of violence from Colombia's history. Each day, as I studied the street art opposite my hotel room, I tried to process its impact on my Western mind. There was something dynamic in the images beyond anything I'm used to seeing in American cities. Next. I spent most of the first week in conference sessions. There were numerous speakers, academics, activists, village leaders, and politicians, representing different groups involved in the effort to establish a peaceful settlement between Colombian government of Juan Manuel Santos and the FARC, the leftist guerrilla group. After years of struggle, a settlement was reached in 2018. When you consider the scale of violence endured over 50 years, the peace established, go away. Sorry, can't get it. Okay, sorry.
What's that?
All right, maybe I can do it I can't get the thing out of the way. Okay. The peaceful settlement between the Colombian government of Juan Manuel. Oh, nobody read that. Okay, got it. Sorry about that. After years of struggle, a settlement was reached in 2018. When you consider the scale of violence endured over the last 50 years, the peace established in Colombia felt like a miracle. We learned, though, that it took years of dedicated effort at great personal risk. As a member of COV&R and former president of Theology and Peace, I am used to discussions about scapegoating, rivalry, systemic victimization, eruptions of mob violence, and the challenges they present to peacemaking. Rarely have I heard such powerful testimonies, accounts of peace overcoming the dynamics responsible for the contagion of violence. Colombia had something to share, not only with us, but with the world still dominated by the Western colonial worldview. Next. The last day we toured the city, accompanied by Carlos and Ruben, graduate students who helped organize the conference, and Carlos is here. Pointing to the graffiti on the Justice Building where thousands were tried by tribunals. They described the desperation of families whose loved ones were marched in, never to emerge again. People protested the government's brutality by spray painting graffiti on the Justice Building. Each time the government erased it, the graffiti would reappear. Anyone caught in the act could be disappeared. Up until the end, the old regime prosecuted the graffiti artists. When our tour moved on to Candelaria neighborhood, Carlos and Ruben pointed to a finely detailed poster on an exterior wall. They told me the graffiti artists won out. The posters like this one, which predated the 2018 agreement, helped win the revolution that street art, music, and poetry played a major role in the peaceful transition of power. Next. 1 block later, I caught sight of a stunning figure. Next. A jaguar. This is my photo. The photo I took of the feline doesn't begin to capture the impact it had on me. That was the first of many jaguar sightings. Next. During the previous regime, graffiti was a common form of political protest, as I said, which emphasized slogans protesting the regime and demanding peace. There was more graffiti than images. However, even before the peaceful transition of power, the progressive mayor of Bogota issued a series of decrees legalizing and encouraging street art. The city held memorial festivals at important landmarks that represented Colombia's violent history, the corruption of its political elites, as well as its contradictory path towards modernization. In 2014, before the peaceful transition, the mayor of Bogota established one of the busiest arteries in Bogota, built by a dictator, considered a symbol of corruption, as an open-air gallery of images to commemorate the victims of the long history of Colombia's violence. Next. This set off an explosion of art across Bogota's landscape. I think I might have skipped something. No, maybe I didn't. Okay. In which the Jaguar is probably the most common image. One of the most influential of the street artists, Oscar Gonzalez, whose street name is Guache, who I conversed with, has been painting the streets of Colombia for 20 years. In a conversation, he told me, before that, the graffiti and street art was an underground movement. People associated it with vandalism, punks, and painting at night. Now, the exercise of art as intervention is no longer seen as vandalism. With the revolution in the last 10 and 15 years, many things have changed, and many people see it as an important art for our city. Guache says in a capital of 10 million people, the most important thing about Bogota street art is the revelation of that kind of voice. These were milestones. We had important support to improve our techniques, to make big murals on buildings. It was very important. It was a very important step for the growth of the movement. Next. The images quickly eclipsed the graffiti, marking a significant transition from signs used for political protest to symbols and images that enlivened the people's imagination. As Jung said, signs refer to discrete elements in the individual's psyche, while symbols are expressions of intuitive ideas which cannot yet be formulated in any other or better way. Next. Guache explores symbols like the corn, symbols drawn from ancient Latino American ancient cultures, the work of the women in Colombia, especially women from the communities. Guache also explores symbols of the magical thinking of the Amazonia peoples, which includes the Jaguar, as well as symbols that advance, he says, human rights and the ongoing work of peace builders. For Guache, all these symbols have a common core, peaceful transformation. Next. The Jaguar is the most significant because it is a spiritual symbol in many spaces, a magical symbol for many indigenous communities. It mediates between the real world and the magical world, which includes the use of natural medicines like ayahuasca and the indigenous ceremonies and rituals that accompany it. Next. I'm a little behind my slides, I think. Can we go back one? Okay, that's the Jaguar. Okay, next I have them a little out of order. I'll just bounce back and forth. According to Costa and Fausto, the Jaguar is the master of the house, but was not conceived as host in traditional Western terms, but mostly as a predatory jaguar which simultaneously feeds, takes care of, and embodies its children, while the act of incorporating others, strangers, is predominantly a form of adoption, resulting from a predatory act, and is thus rarely an event of hospitality. Guahibo shaman wear headdresses of jaguar claws turned upward, necklaces of jaguar teeth, and carry bags of jaguar fur that contains herbs, stones, and their snuffing equipment. The narcotic powder used to induce visions is kept in a tubular jaguar bone. Oh, it's messing up on me again. I don't know how to get rid of that. This is really, there, I did. Sorry. Got it. Among the Barasana people, the Jaguar nature of these shamans provides them with their most potent metaphorical attributes. The Jaguar is mediator between the different cosmic levels of sky, earth, water, and between life and death, nature, and culture. The mediating abilities shared by the Jaguar and the shaman allow the latter to kill and cure, to control the passage between life and death, and to mediate the worlds of humans and ancestors in ritual. Okay, can we, okay, let's go forward and see where we're at. Next. Okay, this is an important slide. Got it right here. Guauche says the jaguar is also a symbol of the preservation and conservation of the rainforest. It's a power symbol for the community, he says. We have a small population of jaguars because of deforestation. Many people go to small villages in the Amazon forest because they're looking for peace and some land because of poverty and the hardship of the people. Many people from the land don't have education. The jaguar is a symbol of the shrinking of their territories. It's a social problem because poverty made the people go there and cut the trees to create land for themselves. 1% of the population of Colombia is the owner of 80% of the lands. This is the history of our iniquity. In that way, the jaguar is a symbol of the resistance of the jungle itself and its communities, of the memories of the people who are resisting from the culture, keeping their traditions, keeping their language, their cultures, and their territories. That's Guauche. Okay, next. Probably going to run out of time. Oh, here we are. Okay. Anthropologist Michael Taussig places the shaman at the heart of Amazonian culture. According to Fausto, the jaguar shamans wore jaguar skins to metamorphose into jaguars. Not as a form of imitation, they become jaguars, mediating between night and day, life in the underworld. Next.
Okay.
Happened again. Come on. Okay. Sorry, I keep being bumped out of my thing. Okay. In Bogota street art, the jaguar is often featured with images from Colombia's past. This was painted during a memorial festival in Independence Square. Taussig described the Europeans' encounter with the jaguar shaman. Between the world of man and that of the steaming jungle, there's a powerful mediator. The jaguar that was also a man, an Indian man, and a witch. Not only Indians, but many of the witches hold this to be true. And these are not just the ignorant whites, but also those who have traveled, who have come to know the world and have some education. This jaguar differs from the real animal, and that the real one only attacks weak and unarmed people when the odds are in its favor, when it can use treachery, or when it is persecuted and harassed by hunters. The jaguar that is possessed by the spirit of the Indian witch, however, is very different, for this will attack humans without provocation against all odds. Symbolically, the jaguar functions as a transcendent third that intervenes to protect the people. So it doesn't mean it engages in actual violence. Taussig says the Europeans introduced a level of violence and barbarity founded in a toxic rivalry based in the West's oppositional thinking, which they projected onto the jungle. Almost immediately, the white men started to believe in the jaguar and afraid a jaguar might ambush them. Clearly, this threat lurking in the European imagination was the conquistadors' own shadow. Taussig says the Europeans' projection of their savagery onto the indigenous tribes was incredibly disproportionate. As soon as they began extracting rubber from the forest, the barbarity they exacted on each other and on indigenous people they forced into slavery is too barbaric to adequately describe. Unfortunately, during the 5 centuries of colonization, the shamans could not protect the people or the jungle from the Europeans. As Western virtues and values were imposed on indigenous people, the Amazonians found themselves in a highly demoralized position on the negative end of the West's oppositional understanding of identity and toxic rivalry. Next. So I just want to show you this movie. I wish I could tell you more about it. Oh, next? Got it. Okay. I highly recommend this. This film, Embrace of the Spirit, 2015, exposes the viewer to some of the brutal impact upon the Native Americans. It not only demonstrates the impact of colonialism, but it demonstrates the mimetic nature of the shaman's relationship with the jungle and how that interfaces with the toxic mimesis of the Europeans. While a shift in identity was imposed upon the indigenous people by the rubber barons and the Catholic missionaries, which robbed the people of their tribal culture, it didn't necessarily rob them of the deeper structures of the Amazonian psyche itself, most notably the phenomenon of shape-shifting attributed to the Jaguar shamans. Next. Thank you. In Amazonia, shamans, okay, I'm going to skip because this is where I do talk about Gerard in masks, but I want to skip to something I think is really important. The Amazonian understanding of identity. So we'll skip prestige. I mean, the loss of the Amazonians' prestige is also a loss of prestige for the people because they're in mimetic relationship with the shaman, and he's in the shaman, not necessarily he is in relationship with the jungle. Next. Okay. Even if I don't get to finish, this point I think is really interesting, and if you want to know more about it, I'll tell you. While the Jaguar shaman appears to fit certain aspects of Gerard's definition, there's a significant difference cultures generally. Historically, indigenous Amazonians had a different understanding of identity. According to Velasa, by the 20th century, many indigenous living in proximity with whites had completely given up traditional clothing and adornment. In their minds, dressing in European clothes, dressing in jaguar skins, made them whites. They did not experience this in the ways that, say, a European tribal... Stop it. I just hit the wrong thing. Ugh, sorry. I've lost my... Okay. I have to find it again. They did not experience this in the ways that European tribal groups might experience a parallel loss. In Amazonia, identity is not fixed, which also makes them open to the other. However, Velasa says this changed in the 1980s when indigenous rights aligned with environmental activism. Amazonians began to display feathers and other adornment together with Western clothes to conform to Western conceptions of what indigenous people should look like. Changing their outward appearance had unintended yet profound impacts. They did it because it was the only way they could get anyone to come to their display at the UN for indigenous people. If they wore Western clothes, no one would come in, but if they wore Indian feathers, they would. So, however, Velasa says this, okay, I already read that. In Amazonia, the Tucano, for instance, extinct animals can transform themselves into beings of other species. For instance, when a riverbed dries up, fish will turn into birds, and when Amazonians donned indigenous-looking clothing and feathers, they were no longer whites. They were indigenous again. Okay, I'm going to skip that. Next slide. So back to the street art. So you know that they can change their identity. On the facade of the Hotel Inter Bogota, the street artist depicts political violence above which rises a large shaman-like figure wearing animal headdresses. Oh no, that's the wrong one. Can you go? What slide number is that? Oh, here you can. Yes, perfect. The figure in the center wears a jaguar skin with headdress in the style of an Amazonian shaman. The jaguar's eyes are bright. Rays of bright light emit from the jaguar's forehead. To the left of the shaman, there's a scene from Colombia's violent history. Next. This is Guache. Guache says, we're living at a special moment in Colombia's history of political and cultural change, a period of transition between the end of the war in which new voices are involved to create a new culture. Our work in the street art comes not just from art. We don't make art for the fun or just for decoration. We have the heritage of the struggle of the people, and it's inspired by very hard times, and it has a political voice. We're trying to recognize another voice which before was not recognized. I mean the voices of the indigenous communities, the voices of new ways of making community. So this is a picture of Guauche video mapping. So video mapping is like murals, but it's done at night, and they use technology to video map onto the buildings. And this is a Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. In his career as an artist, Guauche likes to explore different techniques. 7 years ago, he started to experiment with technology and the performance of video mapping, projection of images on the exterior of buildings. Guauche had projected in many places, including other countries, but the core, the center, he says, of the different techniques is the same. The same images I paint in murals are the same images I project in my video mapping. The difference is I make animations. Okay, I can skip that. Next. When I asked Guauche if the street art is shape-shifting the landscape, he said, definitely. We are trying to change the reality, and the way that we do that is with art, with symbolism, with colors. I'm sure that my murals, our murals, and our projections are kind of changing the spaces and the inner sensibility of people because our changes are not physical change, but deep inside. We want to touch something in your feelings. That is the purpose of our art. The Jaguars are prowling the streets of the city, not just the jungle. The street artists are shape-shifting not only the buildings, but the city's infrastructure, its culture. These aren't acts of hospitality, but of adoption. The Jaguar not only stands between the people and their enemies, the Jaguar adopts portions of the city, one building at a time, so that the city becomes more like a tribal hut and less a place of alienation. That I skipped that part before. It becomes a place to find one's soul rather than a place to lose it. After centuries of Western forms being imposed upon the people and the landscape in the form of architecture, symbols, and clothing, we could extend this, and maybe it's a bit of a stretch, but in painting the walls of Bogota, oh, not again, sorry. The artists have changed its clothing, its hide, so to speak, and thus its species. In this way, the city is transformed into something other than it was, integrating the past with the present, the indigenous with the Europeans, the old with the new. This overcomes the divisions between the oppressed and the oppressor, master, slave, and other such dialectical oppositions. It deprives resentment, its fertile soil, and it empties out fantasies of revenge. In fact, Bogota is drawing artists from around the world. Artists who come to are now flocking there. For instance, there's a YouTube video I would show you, but I don't have access to it because I don't have access to the internet here. But it's an artist. It's called a dream catcher. You can look it up. It's an artist from Argentina. He paints a blue bird on a wall, and he says, birds have the power to do something we cannot do, fly. I think many of us dream about flying. Painting this bird gives me the sensation I might fly with it. In my mind, I am flying. That is why I've chosen to paint a bird. His own experience has led him to the conviction that street art can transform society. As Samuel says, imagery that looks like a psychological response to a social situation is also a facet of the construction of that social situation. There cannot be psychological experience of social reality without images of social reality. Social experience is expanded via social imagery. As the shared psychic reality expressed throughout the imagery evolves, the group and the institutional dynamics will evolve with it. It's not only a matter of reclaiming lost symbols. Oddly, that's Western thinking. Nor is it adapting the Jaguar as a symbol of reversal. It's very hard for a European to inhabit the Jaguar skin and become the Jaguar, to desire as a Jaguar. How am I doing in time, Sandy? I must be out.
5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Whoops, I lost it again. So what I say, let's see. It's very liberating for those who have had their spirits crushed by colonialism's ongoing cruelty. And some will say that colonialism has not ended. They are lifted out of the toxic mimetic rivalry. Through their mimetic relationship with the shaman symbols, their prestige is restored and their souls are cured. As such, they are less prone to resentment and the political slogans of the populist leaders. I skipped that part earlier. This is my last slide, I think. No, we can stay here. African philosopher Achilles Membe says colonialism's particularity lays in its manufacturing and I can't say it, of suffering that in response solicited neither the accepting of responsibility nor solicitude nor sympathy, and often not even pity. Rather, it does everything to deaden its people capacity to suffer because the natives were suffering. It does everything to dull their ability to be affected by this suffering. Further still, colonial violence worked to capture the force of desire of the subjugated and channel it into unproductive investments. By claiming to be acting on behalf of the interests of the native, and in their stead, the colonial machinery sought not merely to block their desire to live, it aimed to affect and diminish their capacities to consider themselves moral agents. But in Colombia, it will fail. While I wouldn't dream of diminishing, this is like my last paragraph and I lost it again. While I wouldn't dream of diminishing the role of the peace activists and community organizers played in bringing about the peaceful revolution in Colombia, I think it's important to draw attention to the part street art played. The fact that it's become a tourist destination not only confirms the metamorphosis of the city inside and out, but not through superficial persona, I skipped that part, but through a dramatic integration of its internal oppositions, a process that's far from complete. Tosig, after living 20 years among the tribal people of Northwest Colombia, describes the sort of image-laden experiences one may have, for example, taking yage. He suggests the immersion of the self in images is more than seeing. It's a series of becomings, a process of images being passed from the shaman to the person having visions. Tosig said, to pass into an image or have an image, pass into you has to be one of the most fascinating possibilities in a human life. And so, if you want to know more about that, watch the movie, Embrace the Serpent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Palmira. I study political science now. I finished my master with a thesis about mimetic theory and political power. So today I gonna talk about our current president now. I did an analysis with the mimetic theory. So I will start. Victims as a political platform. In 1997, Mexico began the transition toward democracy. Discursively, great concern for victims began. In jurarial terms, complete modernity had reached Mexico, while a great condemnation of the indifference of the victims began. The first president to make victims a central issue was Vicente Fox in 2000. A 6-year term earlier, Ernesto Zedillo had spoken about drug trafficking and confronting money laundering, not a word about victims. Fox changed the discursive meaning of the victims. Before him, only President Miguel de la Madrid in 1982 used the word victim in his inauguration speech to talk about campaigns that could not be victims of speculation. Before Fox, in the inauguration speeches of the presidents, there had been no reference to those marginalized by the state, to the sick or the injured by the social political circumstances of the country. This doesn't mean that previous presidents didn't do things for helping them. On the contrary, many of them had managed to reduce social gaps and get many victims to abandon that status. But Fox came to power with the opposite discourse. He was in many ways an outsider. He called out to those who had been forgotten during the older regime. He spoke of the marginalized and the poor, but mainly he alluded to the victims of political violence, a group of victims of which he himself was part. He said, "The common citizen is a victim of the force of the state due to political enmity to disagreement." Fox also spoke about the most recurring victims in Mexico: poor, women, and indigenous people. But when it came to promising paths of action, he stated that it will never be through resentment or revenge. He stated he did not feel a desire for personal vindication or aspiration to reinterpret history. Although Fox placed modern concern for victims as the center of the Mexican political discourse, he had great difficulty in being recognized as their protector. The first problem was the emergence of a mimetic double, the opponent from the Democratic Revolution Party and head of government of Mexico City, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. While great concern for the victims arrived in Mexico, in the speech and the importance they should have in public life, started the dangers that Girard announced in I See Satan Fall Like a Lightning, the fight for authenticity of protection of the victims became part of a political war between President Fox and the head of the government, nicknamed AMLO. After several conflicts between the two, in Fox's eyes, AMLO began to be a problem for governability in Mexico. AMLO continually disqualified Fox and called for demonstration against federal government. Fox and AMLO were then involved in an escalating mimetic rivalry. The aggressiveness in the speeches took an increasingly predominant place, until Fox, with the intention of putting an end to his opponent, decided to remove his immunity to impeach him in 2004. AMLO invaded a property that, according to him, had the intention to connect a hospital to the victims. Since he had broken the law, Fox didn't waste the opportunity to try to finish off his opponent. Fox didn't have AMLO's important role in the Mexican political system. The two main parties in Mexico, the PRI of the center and the PAN of the right center, bid mimetically for power. Both considered that it was convenient to have an element in the center that they could manipulate to affect their main opponent. At that time, AMLO was already an experienced politician, so he understood that it was better to play it as a hinge for both parties, since in this way he avoided paying favors and the reward was very high. While the two big parties competed politically, he grew with anything to anyone, sometimes helped by the PAN to harm the PRI and sometimes helped by the PRI to harm the PAN. AMLO considered himself a permanent victim of a coalition between the political and economic system. His career in government, his public office, and even being protected by entire political party, the PRD, were both little to him. Regardless of this, AMLO considered himself a victim that deserves to be heard. According to AMLO, unlike Fox, who would govern for the victims, from this moment on there was true concern from the victims in Mexico. AMLO affirmed that he didn't know the victims because he himself was one of them. AMLO changed the political sense of concern from victims that is exercised from power with public policies for protection to a more ideological sense. For him, what specifically was done for the victims didn't matter so much. What mattered was who said it, their identity, and the victim symbols they had. Only true victims could defend victims. In his book Barren Sacrifice, Paul Dumochel defines modern state with the notion of economization of violence. There is an even theoretical distinction to separate good violence from bad, but this definition is based on the idea that the modern state has banished the traditional groups within the state, the clans, the large families, and others. In doing so, the legitimacy of violence is exercised before another who fulfills the traditional form of establishing unanimity, that of a victim within the group who, when is sacrifice, fulfills the self-externalization of social guilt. Given this conception, the victim represents a great problem. If evil is outside the limits of our society, the victims we create are increasingly less useful to create unanimity, at least from the discourse that affirms the state notions that equality exists in the face of the protection that the state offers. Therefore, victims in modern states are conceived as the result of an exacerbated rivalry between individuals or politicians, which leads to indifference towards third parties. The place of victim makes us uncomfortable because it extends to our already widely assumed social demystification. Victims remind us of our failures, both social and individual. Since the founding of Mexican state, the idea of victim is essential to our own identity formation. We were victims of the colonial state and later of a Creole independence government, which also assumed itself as a victim of the Spanish Peninsula. For us, legitimate and illegitimate violence was never in the state's conception. The state was born without concern for the victims, and the church welcomed them as a part of a much modern understanding of the conception of the victims, a general concern towards the indigenous people, those who had not been considered in the formation of the state, in the social contract. Pain and social guilt have always been placed on the unprotected or on those whom the church protects and the state violates. The notion of victim has always had a place outside the state, in the adverse territory that roads and resources have not been able to reach. As Girard rightly says, the world today doesn't provide us with anything capable of satisfying the need to condemn ourselves. Therefore, when an opponent like AMLO came to public life, many social segments recalled their great indignation at the Mexican state, which in many ways, as pointed out by the PRD, continue to have characteristics of the peninsular state. For President Fox, the alternatives to respond to this speech by AMLO were reduced. Despite having arrived to presidency with radically victim-centered speech, the fear of blending in this unpolitical enemy led him to moderate. The last year of his mandate, he focused on sending only one message to Mexican society: I'm not resentful. Girard considers that a fight for one who best protects the victims has a lot of titanism and political risk. But in strict terms, the victims remain secondary in the mimetic conflict of those who claim to be their true protectors. Mexican society was no exception in this, and in the name of victims and a new leader who spoke of them much frequently than the current president, it turned to its traditional scapegoat, the state. The omission of the former presidents to name the victims also made politics in their favor, made the new outsider a desirable politician. This is how AMLO arrived in 2006, with a radical stance from which he became the PRD candidate for president. It was the most competitive election in the history of Mexico. He lost against Felipe Calderón and called himself a victim of the political system. As if Calderon agreed that AMLO represented the victims, he never mentioned the word victims in his inaugural speech. AMLO conceived of himself as a victim of President Fox, but he was not a classical victim because he had enough resources to fight against what supposedly oppressed him. Among the symbols of power that he said oppressed him, he raised a cultural war against the Altiplano, Mexico City. After the attempt of impeachment decapitulated him as a victim, he offered an interview to an historian, Enrique Krause. In said interview, he understated the world and magnified his own history. I'm a victim. AMLO spoke The only who could represent the victims was him. He tried to monopolize the role as a victim protector. The first victims he faced as head of government were those who suffered from the increase of kidnappings in Mexico City. On May 7, in 2004, they demonstrated. The call was for those who had been victims of insecurity, but the manifestation grew larger, and thousands of people came to protest the ineptitude of the head of government, López Obrador. AMLO spoke about it. He said in the meeting against him was only a plot. With these acts, AMLO moved further and further away from his political models, Lázaro Cárdenas and Benito Juárez, but with great political intuition that led them to confront the political problems of their time rather than calling them personal threats. According to Ducharme, the state is one that defines legitimate and illegitimate violence. So a ruler who calls himself a victim seems contradictory. Possibly without the media, it would have been impossible to project a figure of victim, but AMLO understood that victims sell, and that he could position himself on the national agenda through them, and for this he needed propaganda. Propaganda, political propaganda, in Mexico works as a spotlight that attracts, started and poorly focuses cases and something beyond their own lives. It works as a set of symbols that allow us to reject the rest of the models of our daily lives and focus on a striking, great, extraordinary model. It has a lot of the advertising principle that is not the product, but was achieved through it. When attention has been achieved, a large part of the society has focused on the one point, transmitting message stop being an impossible task. Political campaigns are carried out under this idea. So for AMLO, his morning conference that began in 2000 had exactly this propaganda purpose, to attract attention and then send the message that he is the model from Mexican society. For Ducharme, indifference is just as ambivalent as a sacred in Girard. On the one hand, the monopoly of violence arises because it breaks the traditional ties that generated endless cycles of revenge, but on the other hand, it causes the victims to be completely alone because the reciprocal solidarity that traditional ties entered has ended. According to Ducharme, the political organization on which democratic system rests is based on the monopoly of violence of the servant or the state. Violence is established around the legitimacy and illegitimacy, as framed by political power. López Obrador always presented himself above this kind of political conflict. Also, he had different affronts with characters who didn't agree him, such as President Fox. Discursively, he always presented himself as a kind of religious leader who doesn't suffer the consequences of desire, AMLO presented himself in mimetic terms as a coquette, who pretends that he is exempt from desire itself, that is fascinated by his competitor. This is how he was assumed as a model that all citizens should follow, including their own victims. Before he came to power, he encouraged citizens to protest against the federal government. As soon as became president in 2018, he called on the victims to resign themselves and keep quiet. He showed his resentment and his vengeful desire. He became an aggressor with all the tools to create victims. AMLO created more victims than any other president. Also, discoverably, he became obsessed with presenting himself as a defender of victims, but his entire as a president period, 6 years, focused on the victims that previous president had created. As Girard says, also, there are victims in general, but the most interesting are those that allow us to condemn our neighbors, who in turn act in the same way with us and remember above all those victims for whom they hold us responsible. Through this incendiary speech, AMLO created the feeling that the victims he had marginalized were traitors. Let us remember that the figure of traitor, according to Ducharme, is an individual who is totally inserted in the community, but who, due to certain symbolic elements and behavior, seems to be a victimizer. He becomes suspected of wanting to destroy the community from within, creating a scapegoat who was previously a friend of many who show hostility. The group of AMLO victims was totally uncoordinated, but AMLO turned it discursively into a group of conspiration who have an objective which is known, which acts completely coordinated and therefore is a great threat. López Obrador won with 53% of the votes of a vote of 89 million citizens. When he won the presidency, he continued with a speech about the victims, including himself, for 3 main reasons. First, it allowed him to easily escape from questions. 2, it positioned him as a pure man who provoked empathy in society. And 3, it gave him legitimacy to continue producing victims, since it will be contradictory for one victim to create more victims. In a country where more than a half of the population is Catholic, the victim is not questioned. AMLO had created a notion in which the bad guys, his enemies, were too bad. They had a personal vendetta against him, and those who didn't support him were giving in. But this way of victimizing himself was also product of his evangelical tradition and his megalomaniacal tendency to consider himself nothing less than a messiah. This created a liminal moment. The deviation of the modern state, as Ducharme said, is the perversion against its own citizens. The populist notion of the state also resides in this division, in which the state becomes a machine of victims without denial. AMLO says that the victims of his government don't exist, but not because he doesn't see them, but because he considers himself the greatest victim. Despite creating the large numbers of victims in Mexico's recent history, 200,000 victims of homicide, almost 100,000 missing people, 30 million people who were left without a health system, 2 feminicides per day. All these victims, when they found a voice to speak on their behalf, were attacked by the president. They became, as Ducharme says, traitors. They went from being victims to begin a treat. How did AMLO manage to make the victims as a scapegoat? First, with the notion that he represented all the victims, but it also offered a system in which the middle class could be blamed themselves for what happened, could flagellate themselves for having been indifferent to those victims in the past. Liminality created more victims, but gave the impression of those who needed it that their grief will be remembered only they followed the leader who legitimately represented the victims. For the poor and the victims of the economic system, it gave the opposite discourse. He offered them sense of pride for being poor. He gave them money, although he took away services, always with a discourse that cultural wealth is more important than economic wealth. Abandon this discourse has great dangers given that AMLO's followers refuse to accept that the president has denied more victims by rejecting stability as the axis of political system. Accepting it breaks with the reward they have received by thinking that evil resides in certain defined spaces, is exercised by certain people, and has identifiable marks. AMLO's Manichaean speech gives his followers the certainty that they are victims. Thank you very much.
Let's try to see questions. Many thanks.
I am very bad in introducing myself. I made my PhD on political science. I made a dissertation concerning the traditional movement. This movement leads by René, whose disciples were Julius Evola, Frijochon, and another ones. But I want to talk about another subject.
So,
My work is entitled Monarchy as Katechon, Monarchy and as an Escape to Mimetic Logic. After seeing the emergence of populism and the discredit of liberal democracy around the world, one must be concerned about the future of humankind. Some people guess that increasing problems can be dealt by assuming authoritarian options. For example, the illiberal democracy of Viktor Orban, or the Singapore model of development, or the Chinese fight against poverty. On those years, the thesis of Francis Fukuyama of the end of history, the victory of liberal democracy, is not as evident as a decade ago. The glory, the economic and political success is no more attained by walking on one path. Envy now has a new ways to be satisfied. The annoying aspect of this situation is the boom of autocratic regimes. In that order, in the political science literature, the monarchy is considered some variant of autocratic regimes. In this building, there is a painting called Social Garbage upstairs. You can see maybe tomorrow with a brighter environment, where you can see crowns, the fascists, the swastika, all these annoying and very bad ideas that were thrown by history. In this way, I will use this painting to describe this situation in political science. This idea of the monarchy as being some variant of autocratic regime is the result of bias transmitted to children without further critical examination. Despite the negative opinion that monarchy still has among the global population, it doesn't seem to exist such a negative opinion about her or this regime among certain intellectuals and political groups. To protect the interests of the West, some intellectual circles have proposed two building of monarchical governments in the most calamitous regions of the world. For example, in the Arab world, where the former monarchies were substituted by nationalistic and Praetorian regimes, whose outputs were ambivalent and in some cases and in others are nefarious. Instead of dictatorial and disastrous governments, those think tanks and nostalgic cycles propose the reestablishment of the antique monarchies. The regimes can, according to the difference, deal with the challenge of a multi-ethnical and cosmopolitan society. In some extreme cases, where there is no order at all, for example, in North Africa, it is also necessary to build an state. The path adopted will determine the future of this country, but it is not necessary to adopt a republican regime to establish a democratic regime, as we have seen before. Well, these approaches have not been ignored by inimical contenders of the rule of the world. The Russian Budanov, follower and companion of Alexander Dugin, the Putin's ideologue, in his article, in one article, underlined that the monarchical path seems to be possibly reevaluated, especially for places where, given the populist nuance typical of several regions, it is not possible to opt directly for a liberal democracy. For example, the kind of regime of the United States or the Western Europe under Republican form, especially in the Arab War. The case of Bolivia in this moment is the most dramatic one. The country is split in 3 different regions with autonomic governments, and the idea is to reestablish the unity of this country by bringing anew the dynasty that was overthrown by Gaddafi. Well, in a changing scenario, the old statement became void. Even the principle of heteronomy versus of the autonomy in democracy. The necessity of a modern state refrains the activity of the masses in crucial areas. The general tendency of democracy is to put outside political contention, for example, the case in Mexico with the judiciary power, some branches of core importance, especially bureaucracy. Now, we have independent organs ruling the economy, finance, health, and other issues. Maybe the symbolic phase of a state could be stay apart of political fight. Therefore, it is time to rethink of monarchs. It is necessary to reconsider the discussion. Populism is, in my way, the logical consequence of mimetic phenomenon in a political field. Looking for recognition, the people choose a leader. Since Sila to Milei, the people feel they choose and obtain recognition with this mortal decision. They allure the consortium of the elites that disapprove their way of life, and they dismiss them. In the political science works, for example, Martin Sainz, in his defense of democracy, does not seem to pay attention of the existence of a crown head in the United Kingdom. Arias seems that he thrown his arguments against autocratical regimes, for example, in this Martin Sainz article, to the regime that was led by Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. Therefore, an association between monarchy and this last type of regime is not self-evident. Although, in sense, democracy is considered the only game in town, the way to establish a regime of this type is not yet clear. Some point to the need first to consolidate the states, the state wielding, the process of state wielding. Others to the need for the process to run parallel to that of the constitution of that democratic regime. Where is René here in this discussion? Well, we must remember that the logic of desire is tripartite: an object being loved, a loving subject, and someone who was the loved object. In this case, the political right to choose representatives covers the idea of glory, that thesis of Francis Fukuyama. The theory of modernization can be brief so. As soon as an individual escapes from the sphere of necessity, he demands another kind of good, for example, political recognition. In that order, democracy has sold itself as the best way to ground on the social scale. It could be true, but finally, this process brings the logic of seeing the other one as an enemy, as a monster. Have you not been in a discussion on social media, for example? Democracy is based on the idea of public contention, moderated by civil virtues. That is the idea, the ideal. Reality is very different. The popularity of democracy is based on greater opportunities to hold a public office. But as Jason Brennan, the author of a polemical book called Against Democracy, has shown, the chance to influence in a political resolution is almost near to zero. For a normal citizens, is almost near to zero. Democracies tend to be oligarchies, but the poison is instilled in the population. The mimetic logic increased time after time. Jason Brennan, maybe he's not criticizing a formal regime, but the mimetic logic. In that order, he proposed to escape the mimetic process, the idea of epistocracy, a government of the experts. Unfortunately, for the American philosopher, the actual democracy is an epistocracy. Maybe he must study a more natural alternative, the monarchical one. Populism is the logical consequence of democracy, and it is possible to conclude that is the regime and by accelerating the mimetic logic. The politic is a tendency to see like enemies people that could be otherwise our friends. The logic is inherent to democracy. The discussion concerning populism, polarization, the democratic backsliding, that is a subject in this moment in political science, and the end of democracy are products of a natural tendency of the regime. The problem is the fatal consequence of this logic. When the real democracies were oligarchies, the process is slower but not conjure. Some states beyond, and the countries will be involved in a civil war. Democracy will die as soon as it fulfills its inner tendencies, the equalization of all people in a miasma. How can conjure this motor tendency? In this moment, we enter with the possible solution. The source of a monarchy is veiled by the shadow of history. Some rationalistic people could defy the mystery by eliminating the mystery over monarchs. The problem, as Nicolas Gomez Avila, a Colombian thinker and reactionary, has said, is that you could bring violence to the world by unveiling the ominous. How can a researcher be sure that he does not bring despair and horror to his life with his research? One generation of the illustration brought the horror of the French Revolution. The revolution will never stop again. As a monarch is a good chosen, mimetic logic cannot work. The problem is when democracy, with this idea of equal political rights for all, extends the mimetic logic. That merged society in increasing violence. In a feudal stage, all soldiers had a very greater value. In the age of the masses, the politicians have an arsenal to use. The political fights are restricted to small circles in the feudal stages, but in democracies, the discussion is almost universal and so boundless. A total war is not possible in an old-fashioned monarchy. The transition to a total war was possible because it was necessary to eliminate monarchy as a legitimate institution for the German people, as Ernst Jünger saw it in his moment. The soul of the blood escaped from its restriction and can express all its destructive nuance. The Totaler-Krieg, the name of a speech of Joseph Goebbels, was the expression of the popular impulse toward complete chaos and destruction. The existence of a god, of a mythological hero, creates a model for people. His actions are an example for them. The ideal of a myth is to replicate the myth. In that way, the people try to emulate them, to copy the activities of gods, to test their force, but they don't feel impotent when they fail. Nobody is forced to the impossible. The glory was reserved for some chosen. It was almost impossible to obtain it, therefore there was no envy for the fate of the chosen, or the heroes, or the gods. Maybe sacral contamination was an excellent way to avoid envy, the natural mechanism of mimetic logic. Kings always appeal to justice. They are incarnate justice. Beyond the idiot interests of the landlords and the cities, there is the justice of the monarch. As López de Vega has entitled one of his famous books, the best mayor is the king. And there is an example in the colonial regime that, for example, some Incan representatives appeal to the king for justice, and this example is brief and mentioned cited in this famous book by Ramiro Maestro, The Defense of Hispanity. The king is the axis of the world. He can also cure diseases, as we can see in this book of, I don't remember, the Thaumaturgs and Kings. Order is established as soon as he is in the world. It is the visible head of God, as the Pope is the visible head of Christ in the Church, as Pius IX said in Filius Dei. Kings also exert legitimate violence to refrain other violence, the famous idea of Giraldo de Pharmacus. He is a Katechon who constrains the subversive forces who are pushing to destroy everything. The leaders are the Anomus. They are the Antichrist. So every time a monarch is assassinated, the world crumbles. It is not a simple murder. It is the beginning of the contamination. The death of Romanovs in Ekaterinburg was the prelude and the symbol of one of the bloody regimes in the history, the Bolshevism. No indulgence can repair the crimes until today. Hello. Well, a monarch is entitled by the divinity. It is not only a monocrat, the government of a man in himself, but a divine delegation of power, and in the past the king was also a god, a descent of divine family. The end of history is the consequence of a meeting, the equality, a limitation of the glory of each one. This process is also found in the constitutional monarchies that were integrated in the West. In that way, monarchs escape from mimetic logic, and they can reframe it. Well, there is a process of the sacralization of the kings that explains the change in the idea of monarchy in the last centuries. The ratio of the monarchy has changed since the French Revolution. Monarchy, as the Spaniard and Carlist theorists say, Rafael Gambra say, is not properly monocratic power, or the power of one, but a delegation of authority over one person. D.B. Grant. Therefore, it is impossible to sustain the monarch on other bases, at least for the Carlist thinkers, than religious one. According to Samuel Huntington, the decay of monarchies is correlated to the boom of the new classes. The case of Charles Reza Pahlavi or Haile Selassie are symptomatic. They push for modernization of their respective countries, Iran and Ethiopia respectively, but they seem to destroy the basis of their own power. The mimetic logic permeates society because of the necessity to be heard. The case of monarchs who support modernization process, although they and their regimes did not lead in all cases to a democratic process, and often contribute to the erosion of the states toward a greater openness of the regime. The fall of those monarchies during the Cold War led political scientists to consider this regime as an obsolete one. However, the remaining monarchies have an advantage over republics. Okay. Even in a delusional way, a constitutional monarchy has a no theological substratum of the past eras, and even in this epoch of technological advance, we can conceive a monarch not as a single being like us, but as a people beyond the mimetic logic. Monarchs are the representative of an heteronomous agent, but in that order represent an agent far away from the ethnic and nationalistic grievance. In this case, the psychoanalysis doesn't not serve to conjure mimetic logic. Sorry for this idea that President Hans Kelsen in his book The Essence and the Value of Democracy. The Austrian jurist has shown democracy is a form of government where everybody can fit and in which nobody feels alien. In reality, democracies are oligarchic, as we have shown before, and the plutocrats are people as you and me, and sometimes they obtain money by illegal ways. In recent times, and despite popular opinion, the monarchy seems to be, once again, or to archive, great relevance. Product of the still marginal reflection of some thinkers and leaders of some dethroned dynasties, and in the face of the discontent of the people in today's democracies, the monarchy is shown as an institution capable of overcoming the impasse typical of the political system of our times. Some effort to close monarchs to the people they rule is not the best tool to avoid the mimetic logic. in my opinion. The attempts to close the monarchs to the common people eliminate the feeling of distance, and therefore they erase the respect they deserve. And this tactical movement involves them in the mimetic logic. So we arrive at the question, why do they have, the kings have the right to rule over us? Well, a final question. Could the last monarch survive the plebeian attempts? I am not sure. In conclusion, the monarchical groups, by proposing monarchy as a base form of government, are trying unconsciously to keep aside the final tendency to global annihilation. The rebellions in Nepal are maybe a last chance to avoid that mimetic logic. That mimetic logic erases humankind from the earth. Every time a monarch is dethroned, maybe we are retiring the last catechons that contain the arriving of the Antichrist. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm René Ducharme. I am a Canadian, and I have been a reader of Girard for the past 2 years. And my interest is to apply it to practical issue. So I do that as a clinician. I am a psychiatrist, and I use Girard in my practice, a few things. But I am interested as well to describe some issue in the society of Quebec. So I'm a Canadian, but I was born in Montreal, so I'm a former Quebecers. Now I live in Ontario. So my topic tonight is the mimetic desire and the sovereignty choice. So as you may read these two quotes here, they are quite contradictory. In the first one, the sovereign is the first, and the first one is the head of the state, the king or the dictator, who might be defined by himself. However, when a people vote to define its territory, its friends and enemies, in a word, its desired country, it must be through mimesis of a mediator, according to Girard. So the question I would like to address tonight is it possible to identify a mediator for a people who are confronted to such a choice? Does the distance of the mediator, internal or external, make a difference? So these are the questions I would try to answer using the two referendums on the sovereignty of Quebec held in 1980 and 1994. I will do a brief history of Quebec and the social situation, and I will present the leaders of these two opposite options as mediators, figures of imitation. So Quebecers were asked twice who they want to be, being Quebecers in the sovereign country, or continue being Quebecers and Canadian in the federation found in 1867. These existential choices were challenging for Quebecer, Canadian of other provinces, and the federal government. Nevertheless, they were done democratically without violence, accordingly to the referendum act vote by the government of Quebec. Quebec is a province of Canada since the Confederation Act of 1867, after the French settlement called the Nouvelle France from 1608 to 1760, and the British conquer colony from 1760 to 1867. The two founders' people, Protestant Anglophone and Catholic Francophone, merged in the Federation. However, the legacy of the British era left the domination of the English community, then a majority in the new country, on the business and political domain. Even in the province of Quebec, where Francophone were more than 80% of the population, the English language was predominant. So from 1960, a quiet revolution happened, led by a liberal nationalistic government. The Francophone took control of their financial institutions and the electric power production in a decade. The French became the official language, and immigrants were forced to send their children in French schools. Catholic Quebecers gave up their religion, which had been part of their identity and a tool of survival, partly because the Catholic Church had always been for the status quo and took the side of the British governor during the Patriotic Rebellion of 1837-38. The Quiet Revolution, as we call it, has become a myth for Quebecers, even if it was interrupted by the Front de Libération du Québec, a terrorist group of 133 known members over the years. These mostly young people were looking for a radical change of the social order according to the anti-colonialism Marxist ideology. They made 200 attacks, hold-up, bombs, and one political murder. 7 people died between 1962 and 1970. Most of them were imprisoned and or deported in 1970. The movement has never reached a significant support among the general population, and the government repression of it was approved by a huge majority. It is often said that Quebecers hate violence. The Parti québécois, a socio-democratic party founded in 1968, canalized the sovereigntist movement and was elected in 1976 on the promise to hold a referendum on Quebec's secession from Canada. Before to analyze the mediator, I would like to remind you the hypothesis of Jean-Michel Gourléen, one of the first collaborators of René Girard, in his book, Our Third Mind. He described 3 levels of brain function. The upper level is the rational, the middle one is emotional, and the third one is based on the mimetic process. Of course, when we make a choice, we use reason to weigh the pros and cons, and we follow our emotions, gut feelings, and so on. The mimetic process is somewhat hidden below the 2 other levels of decision. We always prefer to believe in our free will or original desire. So the choices of Quebecers were made at these 3 levels. On the first one, both sides were convinced to have good reason to justify their vote. On the second one, people's emotion as contempt and pride, fear and courage were powerful influence. But for the purpose of our hypothesis, we are going to look only at the later, the mimetic desire through the mediators. First referendum, May 20, 1980. 2 leaders emerged during the intense period of political confrontation. Pierre-Elliott Trudeau, father of the current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, was born and risen in the Francophone bourgeoisie area of Montreal. His father had been a successful businessman against the odds after many years of uncertainty. He died when Pierre was 15 years old. His mother was Grace Elliott, a lady from the Anglophone bourgeoisie of Scottish origin. So he was the ideal bilingual, bicultural Canadian. He had access to the best schools, Montreal, Paris, London, Boston. He became a university professor of constitutional rights and contributor of Cité Libre, an intellectual journal very critical of conservative provincial government and the clerical establishment, before to become a political figure. Leader of the Liberal Party, he was elected Prime Minister from 1968 through 1984. His goal was to establish bilingualism and multiculturalism in Canada, so opposed to any recognition of Quebecers as a people. He judged with contempt the separatism movement as a tribal ethnic regression. He was a handsome, tall man. His first political campaign gave rise to a Trudeau-mania across Canada in 1968. As a person, he was haughty, self-confident, and a skilled debater. There was a love and hate relationship with Quebecers. Trudeau was the external mediator par excellence. His object of desire was a bilingual, multicultural country with a strong human rights charter. On the other side was René Lévesque, a charismatic leader, a renowned journalist, born in New Carlisle, a remote village along the seashore, dominated by the English minority. He knew both culture. He made his way through obstacles thanks to his oratory and writing skills. He became a lawyer, a journalist, engaged himself in the U.S. Army as a war correspondent in 1944. Minister of the Energy of the Liberal government, key actor of the Quiet Revolution, he piloted the nationalization of Hydro-Québec. After a clash with his party about the political future of Quebec, he founded the Movement Sovereignty Association in 1967. Then that became the Parti Québécois. Elected as Premier of Quebec from 1976 to 1984, he led the Yes referendum campaign. He was a short, not handsome, but charming and an exceptional charismatic speaker. Appeared as a simple man, as a Quebecer. René Lévesque was the internal mediator. His object of desire was a small, proud country for a great people. The result was no 60%, yes 40%. Speaking at the noisy and sad crowd after the defeat, René Lévesque said, "If I understand you, you say, see you next time." In 1982, 2 years after the referendum, Trudeau's government repatriated the Constitution of England with the agreement of all provinces, except Quebec, that didn't sign the deal. Canada became an independent country. Second referendum, October 38, 1994. In the second referendum, we had different leaders. In the sovereignist camp, the Premier of Quebec, Jacques Parizeau, who was called Monsieur, always wearing a three-piece suit, was born in the Francophone upper class. Parizeau was a renowned economist. He got a doctorate at the London School of Economics. He played a major role in the takeover of the levers of finance of Quebec as a high civil servant. However, at the beginning of the campaign, the polls were not that good. So Parizeau stepped aside and gave the lead to Lucien Bouchard, a much more charismatic leader. Bouchard, a former Canadian ambassador in France, minister in the federal government, was highly cultivated, a known reader of the Marcel Proust. He resigned from the Mulroney's government when the Mitch Accord failed. That was the last try to integrate Quebec as a distinct society to Canada. He joined again the sovereigntist movement. He became a tragic figure when he almost died from a necrotitis fasciitis in December 1994, a couple of months before the referendum. He had a leg amputated, and almost close to his death, he wrote a letter of tenacity in his hospital bed that galvanized the movement. But both were external mediators by their distinction and their background. They were more admired than loved. Their object of desire was a normal, prosperous country open to the world exchange. On the federalist camp, the Prime Minister of Canada, Jean Chrétien, a follower and successor of his mentor Trudeau, was born in a pure Francophone regional town in a large family. He overcame a facial handicap with a strong guttural voice and has always been proud of being called the little guy of Shawinigan. He had to fight his way to the top. He had been a long-standing tough politician and economically rigorous. Close to the end of the campaign, when the polls indicated that the yes might win, he lowered his tone, and a group of politicians from other provinces came at the rescue. The Quebecers see him as the henchman of Trudeau. He aroused a reciprocal rivalry either. He was an internal mediator by his proximity to Quebec popular culture. His object of desire was, I quote him, "The most beautiful country in the world. Canada is my country. Quebec is my homeland." The result was no 50.58%, yes, 49.42. Why do you smile? The No campaign won by a thin margin, 55,000 votes. The participation was 93%. The Anglophone community and the people of recent immigration waves, where 20% of the population vote no almost unanimously. But for the Francophone, the dilemma was much more tearing apart. The leaders of both camps were Quebecers. Francophone from all ethnic backgrounds vote yes at 60%, but it was not enough to reach the 50% majority. According to Carl Schmitt and Paul de Michel, the sovereign people choose his enemies. So the line was drawn between Anglophone and Francophone. But something else played a role, since Francophones were not unanimous. Would Quebecers choose to imitate more the external mediator each time to avoid the rivalry? The mimetic desire theory states that the internal mediator gave rise to much more rivalry than the external mediator. An external mediator assures the hierarchy that keeps the pace. George Doon said that this morning. Again, it is often said that Quebecers hate violence. Our main hypothesis is that Quebecers were struggling between two mediators when they made their hex on the ballot. They lean toward the external mediator each time to pick their desired country to avoid a potential reciprocal rivalry. Of course, it's not enough to make unanimity on one side or the other, but it had the potential to change the result, especially the second three. We had heard many times along the pro-federalists that Quebecers need a big brother to keep the peace between them. It sounds like the impartial third party described by Schmitt, quote by Dumichel. In this example, the role is played by the Supreme Court of Canada. Many decisions were made by this court through the political process. This is no surprise that it leaned in favor of Canada. Other important decisions to come may trigger a crisis soon. Of course, it is a remnant of the colonialism, and an independent Quebec would have its own Supreme Court, with all Quebecers judges. Finally, the third referendum, question mark. A constant worry of Francophone Quebecers is the decline of the majority, now 77% in Quebec and 22% in Canada, which means a decline of politic power. The assimilation to Anglophone majority in America is undeniable, and especially for the Francophone of other provinces. And in the cosmopolitan city of Montreal, where Anglophone are concentrated. The big waves of immigration is a real challenge, since most speak other languages. In these days, the Parti Québécois is in the first place in the polls. The party program includes the promise to hold another referendum, even if the yes reach a ceiling of 37%. But the undecided proportion is 20 to 25%. Yes, we may see another match in the next 5 years between two new mediators. Thank you.